Howdy, y'all. Look, I'm gonna be honest up front. I was a little uncomfortable about coming here and talk about this topic when I was asked talk about culture. It's like, what the heck do I know about culture, right? And I'm snot-nosed punk kid from San Antonio, Texas, that was responsible for recruiting spies and instilling secrets. But when my friend Diana called, I said yes, and to be able to do it here at Texas A&M is important. And my focus is really I'm here because this facility, Texas A&M, the Bush School, is producing our future diplomats, our future generals, our future intelligence aid folks, our development people, and I want to make sure people that are coming out of here have that perspective. And this is a very U.S. centric presentation, and for our friends online from other countries, it still applies, right? Because I think if we understand some of these questions I'm going to ask, and I want to start my conversation by asking y'all a question. What is that? Teotihuacan, right? But what's the name of that? The actual thing? Anyone? Pyramid of? The Pyramid of the Sun. Guess what? Who made it? Who built the Pyramid of the Sun? Mayas? No? Anyone? Come on, yell it out. Aztecs? No. Incas? No. Trick question. We actually don't know. We don't know who built the Pyramid of the Sun. The Aztecs found it, and they didn't know who built it. The Aztecs are the one that called this the Pyramid of the Sun. I saw this when my summer of my freshman year. That's obviously me in the blue hat. It blew me away. That was the summer of 1996. I don't know why the fact that this thing that we all know and we had read about in books, we didn't know who built it, blew me away and literally changed the trajectory of my life. Because of that experience, I came back here to Texas A&M and added international studies as a minor. And at that time, I had the chance to go to the Philippines. I actually worked at a factory that manufactured integrated circuits. Now, who would have thought in 1996 that that semiconductors was going to be as big of a thing as it has become? And that's outside of Fort Santiago. The area is referred to as the Intramuros. This is in Manila. I also had, when I was here at Texas A&M, the chance to spend time in Italy. This is one of my favorite things in all of Italy. This is Moses in Chains. It's in Rome. Then these experiences led me to join the CIA. That's the seal on the floor of the agency that when you walk through the major building, we all walk past that. And to the right of that seal is the stars of former CIA officers that gave the ultimate sacrifice. And in my time in the CIA, I got the chance to live in India for 2 years. I went to the Taj Mahal multiple times. It blows you away. I always advise people when they go to the Taj, drive, because you're driving along the Ganga River, the holy Ganges, and it ebbs and flows, and you see something in the distance. You're like, is that the Taj? And then the road turns, and you get closer. You're like, wait a minute, it's getting closer. Is that the Taj? It's one of the single most beautiful things I've seen. Then I went on to Pakistan. That's the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad. If you would have asked me when I was here at Texas A&M walking across campus and you said Pakistan, I'd be like, is that dude that lives down the street? I didn't know what Pakistan was, let alone know where it was. And then I lived in Afghanistan for 1.5 years. Now, I didn't live there. That's the Panjshir Valley. It is these experiences in being in places that was so different than what I grew up in, and having those experiences, I learned something very simple. The United States, as we sometimes fail to appreciate and understand how our soft power, the role it has in our broader foreign policy. And that when we talk about national security and working with our allies or defending our allies or defending ourselves, it's more than just defending buildings and infrastructure and people. It's about safeguarding these ideas, the customs, and broader what we consider to be culture. Now, we can define culture in many ways. I define it as the collection of shared beliefs, values, behaviors, practices that define a group of people or society. There are physical elements of culture, food, right? For me, this is how I define American food, right? Nachos compuestos, by the way, not piled on nachos. Barbecue, Thanksgiving Day turkey. We define it by our brands, right? Like I always ask folks when I brief or talk to incoming foreign policy officers or foreign service officers, I always say, what's the Chinese equivalent of Coke? Nobody ever knows the name. I'll be honest, the number of times I've asked that question, I ask it because I want someone to tell me. I should probably do the research. But you think about the brands that are so iconic across across the world. Our brands are part of our culture. Obviously, our music. You know, some of the older folks here may not know who the guy on the left is. That's Jelly Roll, right? And we all know the one in the middle. Kendrick Lamar, didn't he win he won not a Pulitzer, but a Peabody. Yeah, he's won all kinds of awards, right? He was most recently in a beef, a rap beef with my man Drake from Canada. But our music defines our culture. Our sports, our art, right? Like, you know, I was lucky when I came here to Texas A&M. We had the Visual Art Society. We had the number of entities over in the MSC that exposed us to things. That in the middle is Jackson Pollock's. I think it's 17A is the title. Single most expensive piece of art that's been sold by an American artist. We all know American Gothic on the right? But Basquiat on the left is probably one of the more famous American artists. And these are some of what I call the physical elements of culture. But then you have the intangibles, right? Our customs, our traditions. We know a little something about traditions here in Aggie Land. Our beliefs, our values, our social norms, right? These are some of the intangible things that make up culture. And what was fascinating in preparing this talk, I thought, guess what? Those may not be the three pieces of art that I would have picked that I would consider American culture. I was like, what are some people going to know? I'd probably have different ones. On this picture, look, I love the WNBA. I think what Caitlin Clark is doing is fantastic. I think WNBA basketball right now is like watching the NBA in the late 80s, early 90s with Magic and Larry Bird. But I probably would have put Carl Lewis up here. I probably would have put Muhammad Ali up here as icons from sports that I believe encapsulate our culture. I do that because I'm a Generation X guy, right? I remember watching Carl Lewis running. And for some, if I put a picture of Carl Lewis up here, y'all probably wouldn't know who it was. Musicians. I would have had some old school 90s R&B people up here, right? That y'all would be like, who is that, right? Like, I might have had DeBarge up here, and everybody would be like, who's that weird guy, right? Like, I would maybe have Jamiroquai up in here. I put this, I want y'all to think about who are the three people y'all would have put on this slide to show what American culture really is when it comes to music, right? And I want us to do that thought experiment even on the food and on the brands. I want us to do that thought experiment because I think the thing that I learned through this experience is that culture is not monolithic. We want to break it down and say that that's why I come to that conclusion why we talk about a patchwork, right? That America is a patchwork, it's a tapestry, right? Because it is an amalgamation of a lot of things, and we all have. No one would disagree that Carl Lewis is an iconic sports person. No one would disagree that Jackson Pollock is important to the art history of the United States. No one would disagree with these things, but we may identify with different things. And the part of our culture, and for those that are involved in national security and foreign policy, we forget sometimes the importance this plays in us achieving objectives around the world. And I can make an argument that our culture is what has cemented this century as Pax Americana, why this century has become an American century, partly because of our culture. But guess what? Others are going to disagree. This was, I think Bruno made this comment, this top one, earlier this year. And what was fascinating, a couple of days later, Matthew Iglesias, he's a lot of writing, a great public intellectual, great reporter, kind of retorted that response. And what I think is important is that when you have a culture that is dominant and aware, and people start understanding it, our culture clashes, right? The nuances within those things potentially become scabs and problems that our adversaries try to take advantage of. And we saw that in 2016. These are real. This is a page from the a hearing done in 2017 on the 2016 election, and the role of the Russians and how the Russians were using disinformation into our elections. These were two real pages, Blacktivists and South United, all run by Russian. I believe they were both run by GRU, that were taking advantage of the history of race relations in the United States and using these two websites, these two Facebook pages, in order to antagonize each other, and normal people started getting involved. We also saw it happen with Islam in the United States, and how the frictions on religion, which led to an actual protest. The Russians orchestrated a real protest in Houston, Texas, using these Facebook pages to pull at those culture clashes that we are experiencing. Oh, and by the way, the Chinese tried to do it in our last election. This is a Chinese image that was perpetuated within China and the broader region, talking about how Ukraine, the purple is Ukraine, is basically the size of Texas, and they were pushing narratives that Texas was going to succeed from the Union because of the issue of immigration. And this caught on into our own ecosystems, and people started promoting that, right? And why are our adversaries picking at these issues? Because they know culture is not invincible, right? But patriotism is based on culture. It's our culture that causes us to want to stand up and defend something. Culture is what inspires us. This is what our enemies are trying to erode. And so if they're trying to do that here in the United States of America, we know that the Russians are doing that in Ukraine. We know this is a playbook, and we have to be prepared to defend against this. And part of that means we have to better understand what this means and what our culture is and why we need to embrace it and support it. Now, this is a picture of some of the original Mujahideen. When I was overseas, I would meet with a guy who was one of the original Mujahideen. He's not pictured here. This is not one of him. But he looked like he could have been anywhere between 55 and 92. Life was hard. And I would sneak into his compound, and we would always meet in this one room in his compound, and we would sit cross-legged on this very elaborate rug. And he would always have 2 pomegranates with unblemished skin sitting there. When I get in, he would always speak first. And I would sit there, I'd sit down, and he would start mashing these pomegranates. And he would mash them so much they looked like water balloons. And then he would take the biggest knife out of his pocket, put a little hole in it, and stick a straw in it. And we would drink fresh pomegranates from the rind, fresh pomegranate juice from the rind of this pomegranate. And he would call me Mr. Willie. He's like, Mr. Willie. One day I was in there, he goes, Mr. Willie, I've been a Pakistani for 70 years, right? Pakistan at the time was a relatively young country. He's like, I've been a Muslim for 465 years, but I've been a Pashtun for 3,333 years. And it was hard for me to understand how that much history and culture and impact can have an imprint on a people, on an individual, on a society, right? But it does. And this is the third thing that I learned is that culture is deeply rooted in our experiences, right? And I would say for men and women that are going into a career in national security, that are going into a career in diplomacy, going into a career in intelligence, not only is it important to experience, understand your own culture, it's important to experience, understand other cultures, because you'll then understand what it means to be in their eyes. And it's not just experiencing those physical, tangible things I talked about. It's about experiencing those intangible things. And we have to recognize it's real easy for us in this crowd to talk about democracy because we are at a point where we've learned and understood this. I remember there was a classroom, my first class in international economics was like on the first floor of the Bush School across the way. And I remember our first class was on the rule of law. And 19-year-old Will is like, the rule of law? Of course there's laws. We live in America. There's laws. I was like, this is the first class? We're going to spend an hour talking about something as basic as the rule of law? I'm like, come on. This is a waste of my time. And I didn't really appreciate that until I went places where the rule of law doesn't exist, right? And for us that care about these issues, we have to do a better job of communicating why these things are ultimately important, right? I always talk about democracy. America was called an experiment. Why are we called an experiment? We were called an experiment because almost 250 years ago, nobody thought this was going to work. This experiment in that we, the people, were sovereign, not kings, not queens, not tyrants. This was a unique idea. Democracy hadn't existed on the planet for 1,800 years. Last one was Rome. Julius Caesar screwed that up when he became emperor. The next country to try this experiment was 60 years after us. It was Switzerland. There have only been 14 countries that have been a democracy for more than 100 years. That's not we assume this is a fait accompli. We assume, and a lot of people, we think this is the only form of government that exists because this is the only one that we have ever known. And guess what? Democracy is fragile. It always has been fragile. It always will be fragile. But guess what? We fought civil wars. We fought world wars. We had depressions. We have recessions. We had an insurrection. And we've gotten through all of these things better off at the other end. All of us have gotten through this in a way where we have thrived as a society because we've gotten back to our principles, and we got to know what those principles are. And I would say that our task is not as difficult as having to march in the streets of Selma, or fight on the plains of Gettysburg, or to fight in the mountains of Mazar-e Sharif, right? Or to fight on the beaches of Normandy, right? What it requires of us is that we communicate and talk about why these things are important and why our culture is an important part of our foreign policy and something that should be protected. So I'll end it there. I know we're going to get into a Q&A, but maybe I'm going to end with one thing here. When I was in Pakistan, it was 2008, I believe. There was an earthquake that hit the northern part of Pakistan in Muzaffarabad, killed 90,000 people. It was one of the worst earthquakes the country had ever seen, and at the time, our ambassador at the time ended up becoming a head of the Bush School eventually, and he said, "Hey, Hurd, we want to show the Pakistani people that they have our support. We want to send a team up there as quickly as possible to figure out what they need." And so I led a team up to Muzaffarabad, and we realized they needed airlift. Muzaffarabad was about 12,000 feet. There was smaller villages even higher up, and they were cut off from most of society. So we were able to get 21 Chinook helicopters, like that's in the background there. And I'm there directing this airlift. And by the way, it was middle of winter, negative 20 degrees below zero. Now, I always have to explain to Texans how cold that is, because in Texas, we don't get near that, right? It's cold. And we had gotten a report that this one village had been without food, water, power for 5 days. I was supposed to be jumping on one of these helicopters to go back to the capital to brief our ambassador. And I said, "Hey, let's go pick them up. Let's go to that village, pick these people up, and we're going to take them to Islamabad with us." And so we land in this village. Again, this is not the actual village. We land, the big bay doors of this Chinook open wide. If you've ever seen a helicopter crew, they look like they're from outer space, right? Slick outfits, black mask, hoses connecting all their gear together. And these villagers started piling on, about 150. And this one village elder had a young girl who was about 6 or 7, who lost both her mother and father in the earthquake. And she sees this scene and thinks, like, what's going on? These are people from outer space. And this village elder takes this little girl and hands her to me. And I hold on to this little girl, and she's screaming, she's crying, she doesn't know what's going on. And we ended up taking off. And about halfway through the trip, she finally relaxes. And she lays her head on my shoulder and relaxes for the first time. And we land in Islamabad. We open the big bay doors up. I take the young girl and put her on the ground. She takes about 10 steps and spins around, comes back, and gives me the biggest hug I've ever gotten in my life. And then she goes over to the helicopter crewman, and she kisses him on the hand, and he pats her on the head and gives her a thumbs up. Or here in Aguilar, we call this a gig'em. He gives her a gig'em, and she smiles real big and runs away. And that little girl's face is seared into my brain. Because on that day, the United States of America was the only country that had the resources and the willingness to help people even if they were 7,000 miles away. And the reason that the United States of America has become an exceptional nation is not because of what we have taken, it's what we have given. Right? And it's not just support in time of need. It's not just rebuilding Europe after World War II. It's about this idea, right, that we call democracy. And we have to protect it. It's part of who we are. And if we don't remember that, others won't know it. And we're going to not live in a place that we don't want to live. God bless you and good.
So thank you very much for that, Congressman. That was absolutely incredible. As Professor Vogel here always says, I'm ready to sign up and get going. I'm going to lob you a softball first. For our students out there who are gearing up to graduate and go out and be the next future of public servants, how would you define leadership when making that transition from student to professional?
Look, the way I would define leadership is understand your craft. You should always be trying to improve in whatever that craft is. My first boss, when I was in India, he would always ask us what we were reading. And if we weren't reading a book about India, he would go apoplectic, right? If we weren't reading a book about history or diplomacy or engaging with others, he would go apoplectic. And for me, it's understand that you're like, I don't care how successful you get, if you start your career with this notion that you could always improve, and you're seeking that out, I think you'll be fine. And then raise your hand, right? Like, raise your hand, take on more responsibility, because the sooner you demonstrate that you're invaluable, you'll get more roles. And that was one of the things I always loved about the agency. It gives you real responsibility, real authority early on. When 9/11 happened, I was the fourth employee in the unit called CTCSO, Counterterrorism Center Special Operations Division. And I was a trainee. I was 22 years old. And I just kept volunteering and, was able to have some experiences that was really unique.
That's perfect. A lot of great insight. I know our students really appreciate things like that coming from you. So we do have a few questions coming in. This first one I think is a really good one. In an increasingly polarized global and societal landscape, how can cultural diplomacy and shared values serve as tools for foresighting meaningful connections between individuals or groups with differing perspectives?
Yeah. Look, I'm gonna say something that probably sounds weird right now. Way more unites us than divides us. It doesn't feel that way.
Yeah.
I think people would take our recent elections as an example. It doesn't feel that way. I bet you folks in Germany are saying the same. It doesn't feel that way. And unfortunately, we tend to focus on those things we disagree on rather than things that unite us. Who doesn't like nachos?
I don't know. Couldn't tell you.
If you don't, you're probably a communist, okay? And it's like, who doesn't? I always like, you know what I love about sports? Like, you watch these championship games. They've spent, let's take the NBA, 82 games. Playing 82 games is really hard. And you spend all this time and you get to a game 7 and you lose. And guess what? Second place sucks. But what does second place always do? They congratulate the other people, they hug the other people, and then the winners usually say, hey, those guys were great, give it up to them, right? Like we've stopped learning how to be good winners and good losers, right? And I think when we focus on the fact that there's way more things that unite us than not, I think we'll get better off. And that may sound, I don't know if I can use this term anymore, Pollyanna-ish, right? It may sound like out of whack, but like, look, I've been through the bruising political landscape, right? Like, and even the things that I've learned and the experiences I've had, I know way more unites us than divides us. And how we articulate that, and how we show things that we can agree on. And I guarantee you, I don't care who these two people are, you could probably agree on a TV show you like, a kind of food you like, a piece of art you find interesting, a moment in our history that is valuable, right? And I think we got to be a little bit more conscious of those things. And I can apply that to my time in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So my goal, and look, my dad's 92 years old, and sorry for this very long-winded answer, and I'm rambling a little bit, and I apologize.
Ramble on.
But my dad's 92 years old, and he always said have a PMA, positive mental attitude, right? This is a guy, when he started as a salesman, in the early 60s, got called, my dad's black, my mom's white, he got called the N-word, right? He knew that was gonna happen when he walked into the store to sell his wares, right? And if my dad can keep a PMA in that environment, right, I think we can. But it's gonna require us to continue to fight for these things that matter.
Totally, couldn't agree with you more. Moving into some modern times mixed with the topic of conversation that's going on, the symposium, how do you see the United States moving more into a responsibility role of helping other countries in conflict preserving their cultural identity? Because that is a really important piece of the puzzle that we are talking about today.
Yeah, look, again, I come back to it's always great being back here because I remember things I haven't thought of. I remember going to the MSc. I got the MSc Opus. This was the Opera Performing Arts Society. I think that's what the S stands for. This is the late 90s, right? You know, not everybody had cell phones, so you'd still go to things, and it was like the big deal. And I got to take a date to see some Tibetan monks chant.
Love it.
I didn't know what that meant, if I'm being honest. And I remember sitting in the back, we were back in the cheap seats, and this monk was on the stage, and he started chanting, and I was like, where is, and it was no amplification, no mics. And I was like, where the hell, pardon my language, is that noise coming from? And how did it get so loud? And like it blew me away. And I was like this ignorant kid that didn't have these experiences. And so part of what the United States can do, right, is these culture exchanges and hosting, right? It's like, the State Department does a number of programs where we get, some of the unique things about America and the place where we are, but we need to be doing the opposite and exposing people and also helping them further their craft. I think that's one way of doing it. Look, from a programmatic perspective, I think the United States, we always have a national security. Every year, every new administration comes in with a national security document, and the national security advisor has to go to Congress and articulate what our national security strategy is. That doesn't always include kind of a robust policy or international aid perspective. And I think we need a broader economic national security plan that includes how we spend our resources, how we partner with the philanthropic community to achieve objectives in some of these places. And so one way to ensure that we're helping our allies is the thing that gives them the courage to defend their homeland, that we're able to amplify that and ensure it doesn't get eroded. And so I think those are some of the examples, and just talking about it, right? So like I also think I've learned more about my own culture by seeing other people's culture. And it's like it makes me spark interest.
And going off of that, for average U.S. citizen who isn't really a part of the bigger, broader governmental community, how do you see their role playing a part in that preservation?
Look, I always evaluate things as how would my brother respond? My big brother, he's 5 years older than me. And look, I always use him as the butt of my jokes. He knows it, he appreciates it. But like, my brother doesn't have a passport.
Right? Really?
Yeah, and so like he has zero interest in going to Istanbul and seeing three cultures, how that like work together. He's not interested in that. And so I think part of what we have to do to like the average American, if there's such a thing that exists, is talk about why our role in the rest of the world matters, right? We have an economy that's the envy of the world, not because it's been, we look inside and only do things here in the United States of America. It's because we've helped rebuild Europe after World War II. We, strengthened economies in the Asian Pacific region. We've developed relationships with Canada and Mexico that has increased, our economies by 400%, right? Like part of the success and the things that we benefit from, even if you don't have a passport, comes from places overseas. And that part of that power is soft power. I know that phrase soft power, there's a lot of debate about whether we should use it or not, if it's overused, it's underused, but understanding how that part is part of our plan. Look, my idea, like I believe we're in a new Cold War with the Chinese government. I believe that the United States and China can coexist. I believe that we should compete on some things and cooperate on others. And one of the things I think we get wrong in that is in some of the ways we look at American companies that are operating in China. Guess what? The Chinese are watching the NBA. They're buying LeBron James jerseys, right? They're watching Marvel movies and going to Disneyland and stuff like that. They're buying Coke, right? So that is a way that we can have an impact, and people need to understand that. My brother needs to know that and understand it.
Totally agree. Another question that came in online, amid the rise of a divisive nationalist rhetoric, both domestically and internationally, how can we promote culture, pride, and patriotism in the way that unites us rather than dividing us?
When I was in Pakistan, these I take time because these are hard questions, right? Like I don't think there's any answer, and I appreciate groups like the International Arts and Artists and CEPA trying to explore these things. Obviously, NATO. When I was in Pakistan, I had a number of contacts that would always say, Will, if you're over the age of 35, this is at the time, that you spent time, and you were in Pakistan, you had probably spent time in an American center. An American center was not the embassy or the consulate. It was usually another place where you had access to magazines and music. And the number of people that would tell me the first time I heard rock and roll music was at the American Center in Lahore, or the first time I saw Life magazine was here. The first time I heard an American band was at the American Center. And then post 9/11, what happened? We closed all those things, and the U.S. Embassy has become one of the most protected and defended entities. And look, for a reason, right? And so how have we, I don't think we've thought through enough of how we go back to a level of openness, right? And bringing some of the best things that we have to offer. And in a digital world, we should be able to be doing this more in a macro way. But I also think experiences is going to be a high premium as we get to this even more interconnected digital worlds. And so how are we exposing people to experiences they haven't achieved before? So that's us. That's our diplomatic corps doing that overseas. But I also think there's a response where we should be doing something similar.
Yeah, I agree. One question that was asked, a topic that was brought up in the morning session was topic of AI, and I know you spearheaded some AI legislation when you were in Congress, and I think the biggest question that a lot of people have these days is how it can be used as a tool to help with culture and to cut out the divisiveness in today's modern world from a policy standpoint.
Look, the policy perspective on AI, I think is simple. We need to say it needs to follow the law, right? And that seems so basic and so simple. It's like, well, do we not do that now? No, because we have a very simplistic view of the law, that if it's not written, it's not in that statute, it does not apply. And therefore, cities, states are having different interpretations. And we have made some mistakes in the past. Look, I got my business started in cybersecurity industry, right? I've been very successful in that. But guess what? Cybersecurity industry started because we carved software out of product liability laws, right? We then made the same mistake with social media. Fox News or CNN or Wall Street Journal, the New York Times has never led to young girls increasing self-harm. Social media has. Why? We carved it out of some of the regulatory regimes that these other entities have done. So let's not make that same mistake when it comes to AI and say, hey, guess what? AI needs to follow the law. It is against the law to discriminate. You cannot deny someone a loan because of the color of their skin. It's already a law. So guess what? The AI does that. That's a violation of law, and the people that developed it should have consequences, right? And so I think that's a simple philosophy we should do. And then we should say, hey, really powerful AI, some third party needs to look under the hood and look at it, right? The European Union is doing this when their AI law comes into rule, and they said that anything that was trained by 10 to the 29th flops. Okay, what does that mean? A flop, think of it as just like some kind of execution of code. 10 to the 29th, right, is a really big number. Mm-hmm. And so to train something with that much execution requires like 200,000 megawatts of power.
Jeez.
That's big.
That's big.
Guess what? 2 gals in a garage don't have 20,000 megawatts of power. You're not going to hurt innovation by saying anything that large needs to have some smart people look at it to make sure you're doing some of the most basic things, right? So that's the programmatic side. But those that are caring about this, guess what? We got to use AI. It was like, well, it hallucinates. Guess what? I'm pretty sure at breakfast today, y'all probably passed on something that wasn't true. We've been hallucinating way longer than AI has, right? In a workplace, if you have a new employee or your intern, you're not going to take their work product and just automatically reuse it. You're going to double check it. So we got to use it. So if we want to understand its power, its limitations, where it should go, we have to be adopting it and using it so that we can understand its power as well as its limitations.
Yeah, totally. From your foxhole, what do you believe some of the top threats in today's modern society to not only our culture, but culture globally and the preservation of it would be?
Look, for every tool that helps society, it can also hurt society, right? And AI, generative AI, provides you with the ability to increase with speed how you take advantage of some of those cultural fissures, right? And I think, sometimes we look and think that disinformation or misinformation is like a towel that if we just squeeze it tight enough, all the water is going to get out, right? I think that's the wrong framework. We need to make sure that we're resilient and understand what's bad. Look, I used to use this as an example. We all knew when we were kids, don't get into a car with a stranger, right? Asterisk, unless it's Uber or Lyft now, right? But like we knew when we were in school, like I couldn't use a comic book as research for something, right? Like I'm not gonna, like we have to know that being able to determine whether something is reliable or not, right? And I go back and I always talk to people about, it's like the basics of like cybersecurity. Don't click on something from someone you don't know, right? And if it looks like it's coming from someone you don't know and they probably never asked that, then don't click on it, right? And so it's like, why are we sharing stuff on social media from Joe Schmuckatelli, who have no clue who that person is or what they're doing, and why are you even consuming that, right? And so that how we educate the world, a population, a community on how to be better at evaluating that, that's going to take some time. And the example I'll use, as I said, my dad's 92. The amount of mail, like physical mail that he gets, is crazy. And the amount of people that are pushing him something to try to take advantage of him is shocking. And why, when I see a piece of mail, within a second and a half, I can evaluate whether it's garbage or real, but my father can't, right? And how come in some situations people can look at a video online and realize it's garbage or it's probably made up, and others can't? If we're able to solve that, then we'll get to a way where our information diets are regulated a little bit better by ourselves, not by some entity or organization.
I'm going to push that one a little bit further. Moving into, this next piece of our history, into the next administration, what positives do you think can come out of new policy that will come out regarding things like the social media issues and AI and things of that nature?
Look, here's what I would say. When it comes to like these technological issues, I can give a perspective since George W. Bush, right? Each administration has built upon the success of the last generation. When Donald Trump's first term literally did build upon some of the great successes that President Obama and his team put in. And then President Biden continued some of those exact same things when it came to dealing with AI, with quantum computing, with synthetic biology, with hypersonics. He's done, like it was a continuation. And so I think a Trump 2.0, you're going to see some of that same kind of push. And look, when it comes to social media, what's fascinating, far left, far right, agree on what needs to get done, right? They all believe that the Section 230 carve-out needs to go away. Now, they believe that for the exact opposite reasons, but the end outcome can be the same. So on those specific things, I think there's a few bipartisan issues left. The threat, the great power competition between the United States and our allies in China is one that there is agreement, bicameral, bipartisan support and agreement on. And then the fact that technologies are potentially dangerous, how do we benefit from the upside and negate the downside? I think there's some cooperation. Now, the nuance is going to be interesting, but even though you're going to have unified government, the narrow margins means that they're going to have, if they want to show productivity, that you're going to have to work on some things that you actually agree on, and those are some of the topics.
Totally.
Now, there's going to be a whole lot of drama in between.
Oh, yeah.
Don't get me wrong. But that's where I think I'm happy. I think that trajectory on these issues is going to be given the right attention and focus.
That's nice to hear, because so many people are genuinely concerned about where we're going when it comes to the technologies that are at our disposal these days. Another question, this one's regarding NATO. How do we ensure our continued participation in NATO, given some of the recent rhetoric that's going on?
Look, continue to articulate why it's been the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, right? Prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there had 75 years of peace and prosperity on the European continent. There's probably only one other time in the last 1,000 years where you had seen that, and so it's an important alliance, probably the most important alliance. So those of us that understand that, we have to continue to make that case. It's funny. A lot of people that think about running for Congress, they always call me, and they're like, "Will, what should I do?" And one of the pieces of advice I give, I say, figure out how to explain your bio and say it the exact same way every time. And because you think you've said it before. Guess what? Nobody remembers it, right?
Right.
Like, I can't tell you how many times I've said I'm a former CIA officer, right? It's probably 100, 1,000 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But we got to continue to reiterate it at every chance we get. And because those of us that care about this thing have been talking about it for a long time, we sometimes assume that everybody understands the basic tenets and premises of why this matters. And I'll give an example. When you explain why Ukraine matters to Americans, when I was running for office, I was in environments that people did not necessarily agree with my opinions. But when I would explain that for 5% of the DoD budget, we are dismantling the Russian military and not having to send any of our sons and daughters, most people would be like, heck, that's a good
Jump
thing.
on the train.
How come no one's been talking about that? But guess what? People in this crowd who have probably been thinking about this issue since the start of the conflict have, probably said it a couple times, but we got to continue to reiterate that. So my point is, for those of us that understand the value of NATO and understand the reason America needs to take part of this, is we have to continue to articulate that and talk about it and not think that we're repeating ourselves or get tired of saying the same thing because we haven't done a good enough job of making the case that this is an invaluable alliance that has been part of the reason that we've enjoyed a quality of life that's the envy of the world.
Very much so. Cool. 2 more questions. If
Sure.
that's okay, Congressman.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about how we can encourage respect for cultural differences and for art and artists whose work is deliberately proactive or controversial?
Like, this may not be a popular take, but calm down. It's like if you're so sensitive about somebody criticizing your thing or taking a piece of art as, oh my God, why are they being critical of us? We shouldn't be able to see it. I'd be like, maybe you need to rethink the things that you think are important, right? And like use it as an opportunity to explore your own ideas and experiences. And so I just, from the banning books to talking about artists that are crazy, like it's wild. And as a kid who grew up in the 80s and the 90s, the fact that people like Ice-T and Ice Cube and and Snoop, the fact that like Snoop D-O-G is like a American ambassador.
Oh, he's
right?
still getting it a lot.
Like this is a guy that parents were saying don't listen to and don't do all this stuff. So my thing to those that react in a violent way, be like, it's okay to sometimes look in the mirror and have people question. And not be so sensitive, right? And to those artists that are doing those things, keep doing your thing, right? And keep pushing the boundaries and keep making us think about our role in the world and what we should be doing and why things matter and whether our values are in line with our actions, right? Like keep doing that. And for organizations like this, continue to support that. Because it's important.
I agree completely. Last question. How can understanding cultural differences improve multilateral efforts to resolve international conflicts?
It's a lot of people say that, and I'm going to answer this with a domestic answer. A lot of people say the reason Congress became more cantankerous and adversarial is because members of Congress stopped living in DC. They stopped having their kids go to the same schools. They stopped coaching Little League together because when you know someone, it's harder to hate somebody, right? And so I think that's why understanding other people and understanding other cultures, you realize there's an intimacy and a familiarity that makes us as humans want to be like, hey, you're not bad. You're kind of just like me. We could be able to solve this problem. So understanding other cultures and engaging in that, I think is one of the ways you can ultimately solve problems, because it goes back to my original point. Way more unites us than divides us.
Yeah.
And when we remember that, we'll be a lot better off.
Last thing, just for any of the students who are still here and listening, what piece of advice can you give them that are about to enter the public sphere?
Do something meaningful and hard, right? That's probably the best piece of advice I ever got. When I lost my first campaign for office in 2010, I left the CIA, to run for office. And everybody in the CIA thought I was crazy because I had a great career and I loved the job, and I thought I could help the intelligence community in a different way. And reporters would ask me, well, what's your plan B if you lose? I was like, there's no plan B, because I'm going to win, because here's why. And everybody thought I was joking and be like, that's what you're supposed to say. No, I literally did not have a plan B. And when I lost, I knew when all my money was going to run out. So I had to do something else. And I asked 75 people the same two questions. I was 32 at the time. I said, if you were 32, what would you do? And if time and money wasn't a restriction, what would you do? And I got 74 crummy answers.
Oh.
Right? And literally the 75th was Roger Kramer, one of my closest friends' father. Like my closest friend, these knuckleheads I've known since I was 13 years old. We played freshman basketball together. And Roger Kramer goes, well, I don't know how to answer that question, but do something meaningful and hard, and the rest will flow. And when I go back and look at some of the crazy things that, on when you just look at it that I did, it was something that was meaningful to me, and it was hard, and all those other things will flow from that. And the other, and that would be point one. Point two will be honest, right? Like, the older I get, the more I realize that the consequences of being honest are greater, right? There are consequences of being honest. But the other thing I've learned is the more you're honest, the easier it is to be, right? And so being a person of character, being an honest person requires practice, just like being an athlete or a musician or a mathematician or being in the military, it takes practice. So it seems so basic, right? It seems so basic, but being honest and doing the right thing requires work, because when the consequences are high, if you have no experience in doing the right thing, then you're not gonna be able to do it right. So do something meaningful and hard, and be honest, and have a PMA like my dad told me to do.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the Bush School and everyone, thank you very much for being
my
here,
pleasure.
sir. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah.